Good time zone, friends. It's Druidsfire, and I have a few things to say about professions, aka crafting, in World of Warcraft. I should note that this video actually came out of what was originally going to be like 5, 6, maybe 7 post thread on Bluesky about professions. And then as I was trying to, write the thread, I realized I had a ton more to say on the subject of crafting in World of Warcraft. So here we are. So let's get into it. In fact, this kind of took a life of its own, and I wound up writing a whole script. So I'll be reading from the script. So I apologize if I'm looking around and but it is what it is. Because I would forget like half the stuff I want to say if I hadn't written it down. So that being said, let's begin. Buckle up, cupcakes. So, back in the day in World of Warcraft, vanilla, I started in vanilla. The tail end of vanilla, let's be honest here. I had an alliance guild in server, and a horde guild in server, because cross-faction guilds didn't exist until late in the Dragonflight cycle, and cross-server guilds didn't arrive until the War Within. You were also limited to how many characters you could have on a single server, and sometimes you couldn't make characters from the other faction if you already had characters in the first one. Either due to PvP server rules or simple faction balance rules set up by Blizzard. You can't have 100% horde server, sorry. Or 100% alliance guild either. Me, I'm an alcoholic. I wanted to have at least one character per race, and one character for each class in both factions. So I set up an alliance guild on a server with an alliance name, and a horde guild on a server with a horde name. It's a deep irony that the horde server wound up being dominated by alliance players to the tune of like 95-5. As more races and classes were added to the game, though, all of this became too unmanageable, especially with some of the races were simply less interesting. And two were, in my honest opinion, just not right. Mecha gnomes are basically Doctor Who Cybermen with their willful replacing of body parts with mechanical parts. In fact, King Mechagon could be Cyber Leader, trying to forcibly convert everybody to machines, because that was his story. And the Magheart Orcs had the unfortunate association with the worst destruction of a fan favorite character in the history of all of Warcraft. And that would be the desecration known as What Happened to Urel and her followers turning into genocidal zealots as a mere plot point, an excuse to explain why the Magheart Orcs were escaping Draenor and coming to join the Horde. Anyway, to my main point here. My love/dislike of WoW professions. I don't hate them. I just don't really like what they are. These days, anyway. And I miss the old days when the system wasn't so complex. Now it just looks like a WoWified version, carbon copy of what Final Fantasy XIV has for crafting. If you don't know what a carbon copy is, look it up or ask somebody who's in the ARP. We know. When it comes to crafting in WoW, back in those came to crafting because past tense here. Back in those old halcyon days, I had all the professions sorted out on both servers, so each faction had its full swath of crafters. It was even more stuff to maintain, and I fell off the crafting wagon around Warlords of Draenor and Legion, and I didn't realize until recently that it was less to do with how unwieldy my spreadsheet of doom is, and more about how complex, and for me, unfun crafting became in those expansions. When cross-realm guilds became real, I've been waiting for this for years, I used my non-subscriber alt account during their most recent Welcome Back free play weekend to get my Horde characters, the random pickup characters I made on a third server, and all of my re-rolled or brand new Legion remix characters into the same guild. Suddenly, I no longer needed half of my production crafters. So I picked which of my characters had gone the furthest in each profession and stopped leveling the other faction's crafting, other than the gatherers, because, yeah, I can always use your mats. They still need to make it easier for cross-realm characters to interact with the guild bank and even newer warband bank, because shit doesn't stack until you put it in another empty slot and then you can stack things. However, the warband bank is one of my favorite innovations to WoW. But overall, I could now consolidate all of my crafting mats into my one-person guild's bank. However, I never had any of those old characters give up their production crafts. Some had recipes the other faction's crafter didn't have. And then I realized, when did I use those recipes? I couldn't remember the last time I'd done any of those special recipes. And to be honest, I couldn't remember any especially rare or unattainable recipes I might have had. It's just been so long, and I wasn't about to go digging for them. So the other day, I said, fuck it, and reorganized everything based on what felt right. So my Night Elf Druid had enchantment for one of her 2 crafts. And I decided that my Blood Elf Mage was going to have the enchanting thing, because it felt better to have the Blood Elf be the enchanter. So, I have to tell you, it took some doing to hit the little button to get rid of enchantment, to unlearn it on my Night Elf Druid. The same thing was true for jewel crafting on my Blood Elf Paladin, because my Draenei Paladin is my jewel crafter, as you can see here. So my Blood Elf Paladin got skinning because it was the least represented out of all the gathering crafts, gathering professions, and then I added more herbalists and skinners and fishers to go with the miners. Mining is my clear favorite in any video game when it comes out. It just is. Only one of that first brace of 12 characters slated to play through midnight is a double production crafter, because it would legitimately be too much of a pain in the ass to regrind either of his 2 professions, alchemy and tailoring. However, there are plenty of gatherers to support both his professions, and there's only 1 cook overall, and everyone has fishing. Now, I want to tell you briefly about the brace of 12 characters. So, I have my initial 4-person warband. That's 2 Alliance, 2 Horde characters. Those are my mains. Then I have 4 more in a second warband that are all Alliance, and 4 more in a third warband that are all Horde, because I wanted to make sure I didn't just play all my Alliance characters. Let's be honest, I play my Alliance characters more than my Horde. It's just the way I play. So, having crafters on the Horde side means I'm going to play those Horde characters more often, despite the fact that Blizzard has apparently forgotten the Horde exists. I'm an Alliance mate, and I acknowledge this. That being said, back to crafting. Now, professions change forever in Warlords of Draenor with garrisons, including way more RNG in terms of what recipes you got. Miners are no longer smelted. And that makes me sad, because honestly, the sizzling sound of smelting was my original WoW ASMR. I love that sound. And I may have had 5,000 thorium ore that needed to be smelted down, and I might have just set that on and kind of just chilled with that the other night. I'm just saying I did that. However, due to the ability for any player to participate in any craft via the garrisons, and how a lot of the mats you obtained were bind to character, there wasn't too much call for me to continue crafting. Things were either generic, or the recipes that I wanted for gear or transmog simply didn't drop out of the time-gated via cooldown RNG research mechanics. Legion changed things even further, mostly going back to people having to focus on their 2 primary professions and whatever secondary professions they had. And they got rid of first aid. My tailor thanks you. And now you no longer had to train each individual gathering option in sequence, within Legion crafting. It was all about the discovery of various gathering nodes while you're out questing. So a miner could just train the base Legion mining tier and then go out and start gathering. All of the ores were mineable from the get-go, aside from stuff introduced in later patches like Suramar and Argus suddenly appearing in the sky. But some were still considered lower tier earlier in the cycle of the craft, so one would go gray and stop giving you skill ups before another one might still be orange for a while and still give you skill ups when you mine the node, for example. And they added things like mineral seams and other such, rich nodes that would have a higher yield. And mineral seams, for example, were underground and generally required finding something to get to them. I'm actually pretty fond of mineral seams as someone who enjoys mining. I was sad, however, to discover that miners no longer smelt their ores for content in Legion onward. Quite frankly, because I'd fallen off the bandwagon, I didn't even notice until I went to go find in midnight. Where's my mining? Where's my smelting? It's not here anymore. So, again, I was sad about no more smelting. The way they did it now is each production craft would take the raw ores or raw skins or raw plants or whatever and use them in the recipes, such as Shadowlands enchanters taking a lithium ore and crafting enchanted lithium bars that they could then trade with blacksmiths who needed them to craft armor and weapons. This is bringing back the notion of trading chains that was part of WoW since vanilla, but the Legion iteration cut out most of the mining middleman. However, where Legion lost me in crafting was the crafting tiers for the production crafts. Of course you wanted the best stuff for your alts or to sell in the auction house or if you were a supplier for your guild. But many recipes, even for gear, had 3 ranks assigned to them. You could start off 1-starring a recipe, but you couldn't progress to the 2nd tier or 3rd star without completing the lower rank. These ranks could be things like lowering or greatly lowering the number of mats needed to craft the armor piece, or something like making multiple potions instead of just one. If you had the mats handy, it wasn't too difficult, but it was very tedious, especially for those recipes that had a quest attached to it, or lengthy cooldown. What made it worse was how often recipes for higher rank versions of recipes for higher rank versions of those recipes dropped in various content, and you couldn't use them until you ranked up. So let's say you got a 3-star rank 3 version of a recipe, but you're still at rank 1. Well, screw you until you got rank 2 done, and then you could use your recipe. You couldn't learn your recipe until, you couldn't even learn it, much less use it, until you got the intermediary tier. Legion also added mandatory crafting tables, so that some of those professions which used to enjoy crafting out in the boonies had to be back in Dalaran to do their thing. Miners and blacksmiths kind of smirked at this, I'm sure. I did anyway, because it was just funny to me. However, some of the crafting ranks added in Legion would release the crafter from this burden. Like, tier 3, you suddenly don't have to be in town to do this craft. I'm like, okay, that's kind of cool. However, I fell so far off the crafting bandwagon in Legion that I pretty much ignored it. I kind of ignored crafting for most of my crafters during Battle for Azeroth, except the usual, let's mine all the shit. Looking at some of my production crafters now, some of them never even trained Cultier in crafting. In my headcanon, my Horde character simply refused to train something named after an alliance race. Because, again, Blizzard forgot the Horde exists. This lack of doing anything but the most basic of crafting in Battle for Azeroth, i.e. me and my love of mining, this would come to bite me in the ass in Shadowlands. Shadowlands is the first expansion that I never finished the story on any character because Blizzard had this wonderful idea, no sarcasm here, to tie crafting into the main story campaign. You simply could not progress the story beyond the need to use the rune carver, spoiler, the enslaved and memory-wiped Primus of Maldraxxus, to unlock his legendary memories to empower gear and weapons. You couldn't get legendaries without doing this thing, and it required crafting. By the way, you also couldn't progress certain crafting options without learning them from the rune carver first. So, if you wanted legendaries in Shadowlands, you had one of three choices. Number 1, be the crafter. So you can make the required crafting reagents yourself. Number 2, spend a shit ton of money on gold on the auction house. Because remember, crafting for many is simply a means of making a shit ton of gold. Option number 3, be in a guild where one of your guildies was the crafter. As a primarily solo player in a one-person guild, again remember, we didn't get cross-realm guilds until War Within, and, you know, cross-realm guilds. Yep. So, I didn't also have a shit ton of money, at least not in the amounts needed to finance my main, much less a bunch of alts. This effectively prevented me from completing the main story of Shadowlands. Like, halfway through the expansion, I'm like, well, fuck this for a bag of rocks. I'm gonna go play something else. Which is exactly what I did. If not for Blizzard later letting you skip past that step and just ignoring the needs for those legendaries, I wouldn't have been able to go back and play through zones like Korthia and Zereth Mortis. And I actually like those zones. I still want to go back and finish the Shadowlands story properly, because the notion of the first ones and seeing all the proto-creations in Zereth Mortis was actually really cool. Korthia Korthia kind of reminded me a little bit about the early stages of Argus, whereas Zereth Mortis was the really cool stuff related to this cool stuff in Argus. However, back to Shadowlands, the Jailer boss fight can kiss my ass. That being said, let's turn to Dragonflight and professions. So professions in Dragonflight were overhauled across the board. Anyone who's crafted in Final Fantasy XIV will immediately grasp what Blizzard did, which is basically yoink it! The basic idea of how crafting should work, and wowified it. Now you have all of these fripperies between you, your mats, and crafting your items. Such as secondary skills like ingenuity or resourcefulness, and RNG on the output of your craft. Will it crit? Will it not? Depends. Those of us who still remember the Warlord's Garrison Shipyard mission table well remember how even a 99% success rating on a mission could and often would still roll a failure. Love that. The tiers are now part of the crafting item results, not the recipes themselves like in Legion. This time, the ranks are denoted by 1, 2, 3 color-coded diamonds. 1 is bronze, 2 is silver, 3 is gold. This would become a problem if you're trying to specifically craft something lower for a quest or whatever, and you crit, and it spits out a higher tier item, thus wasting your mats, and you have to go and do it again. It also makes it very hard when commissioning someone to craft for you, because they may not have the ability to make the top tier items that you're looking for. So you have to be way more careful about that if you're trying to get someone to do the crafting for you. Eventually, in Midnight, they would remove that bronze tier and simply go with silver and gold. Silver and gold. Silver. Okay. Silver has a single larger diamond shape, which is slightly confusing if you look at one of those compared to the War Within's single diamond bronze tier, or Dragonflight or War Within's single diamond bronze tier. And gold with a large golden pentagon icon. It's clearly this is the gold. I believe Dragonflight is also when they added labels to crafting mats to tell us what expansion a specific mat came from. Now we're searching through your enchanter's pile of crystals and essences and planar whatsits to try and figure out where the hell you need to go to farm that particular mat, or figure out your storage between current expansion and older expansions. Specializations also came back with a vengeance in Dragonflight crafting, but in a very different way from Classic, where you had to pick, like, you had a choice between gnomish engineering or goblin engineering, and, for example, and that locked you out of certain recipes from that other specialization. Tailoring had the same thing. Blacksmithing had the same thing. And, if you wanted to do them all, you had to do them all. In Dragonflight, specializations are whole trees of options that you unlock by spending crafting knowledge that you'd acquire whilst you're questing and crafting. These options were similar to the ranks crafting had in Legion, but were greatly expanded. As you can see, this allowed players to customize what they were good at, whether gathering a specific map in greater numbers, or maybe gathering at a higher ranked quality if you always want to get the silver versus the bronze, or you wanted to get the gold instead of the silver. This also affected the minor stats used to determine what rank your output would be. It also added a concentration pool that would accumulate over time until you maxed it out. And concentration would regenerate at a slow pace over time. Basically, it was meant that you could spend concentration to increase the quality of your output. And the reason that concentration had such a small limit was it's kind of meant to stop high-end crafters from just spamming through all their mats and glutting the market with high-end results in a short span of time. To be honest, I guess it was kind of better than putting a many-hour or many-day or week-long cooldown on reusing a recipe at all. Because, well, that was some shit that they did in the past. In Dragonflight, Blizzard overhauled the crafting UI into more or less what you see here, what we have in Midnight. The UI itself is actually a major upgrade to the overall profession system, because you have everything in one place. Blizzard recognized how much of a pain in the ass it would be to scroll through every recipe a character knew. So they made this drop-down box at the top so that you can basically see where you are in every tier, and then you can pick which tier you wanted to focus on, and it would only pull up the recipes for that particular tier. And you could also readily see which recipes you didn't know. By scrolling down, it would be unlearned. It would show you unlearned options. And all of your other things are in there, like your prospecting if you're a miner, your milling if you're an inscription specialist. An inscriptor? A scribe? Scribe. However, you can also see which expansions had specializations. Those are Dragonflight on, like, modern specializations. Dragonflight onwards. However, it did bring back the requirement of everyone to have once more be at the crafting tables in the major cities, including folks like tailors who could still craft out in the wilderness even during Legion onward. They did free up a bag slot, or a 3, by adding crafting equipment slots on the UI itself up here in the upper right corner, to where you could basically equip things like your skinning knife would be on your skinning page, and there'd be a couple of additional slots here for secondary equipment that would modify, like, how fast you crafted or how good your secondary crafting stats, like resourcefulness, were. Dragonflight also added crafting orders, something clearly inspired by the fact it would have been amazing to have in Shadowlands to let non-crafters, non-wealthy, non-gilded characters progress past the rune carver without beggaring themselves. You could put up an order so some random other player could make it the thing you needed for a quest, for a gear upgrade, or even a legendary reagent, and the UI would just deliver it to you in your mail. And you could even include, a tip of gold as a thank you to the crafter for their time. Especially, or also as a payment if they were the one that supplied the mats, Best of all, crafting orders are available for every tier of crafting, all the way back to vanilla or classic crafting. Crafting orders is how my behind as hell self could get an engineer to craft the one piece of kit needed by non-engineers to then assemble into the void cycle from revisited horrific visions. That is a sweet ride. This, however, leads me to gently refute a Prepare for Midnight video that I watched before Midnight launched. The content creator insisted that players should just sell all of their previous expansion crafting mats to clear up all their bank and bag space, because these older mats were apparently worthless and you would not need them anymore. Au contraire, mon frère. In a word, housing. In more words, Blizzard added housing decor to every previous tier of professions. So if you wanted to have, say, a Dwarven District banner for your housing plot made by a tailor who happened to have, ground out 240 points of classic tailoring, they could go back to, they went to Ironforge and spent 57 gold to buy the recipe. Well, they would still need a stash of mooncloth and golden pearls, and buy some rune thread and some yellow dye. And of course, they would need a supply of ironwood lumber gathered by someone with access to housing. And right now, as of the time of this video, housing is only available to people who have purchased Midnight. So you can't engage with the housing decor things unless you got Midnight. You can collect housing decor, you just can't use it. So technically, you can engage. You can get a crafter to make you stuff and wait for the time that you buy Midnight, and then you put all your shit down on your house. I will note that one of the more curious things about Midnight crafting, a new addition to the UI that previous tiers of crafting did not have. Well, some of them did, but most of them did not. And that is appendices. These are not as cool as the appendices for Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. They are nothing more than a series of entries explaining all the new fripperies you need to maximize your crafting. You want to know about concentration? Here's a little entry about concentration, explaining it all. Well, how about ingenuity? They got one of those too. A lot of empty real estate here on the UI, I'm just saying. So, pretty brief descriptions, don't really go into the details. The bottom line here is that WoW professions are officially so complex and convoluted that you need to carry a fucking glossary around with you in the UI because, I don't know, maybe they just don't want you alt-tabbing out to look at Wowhead or something. Or Icy Veins. I don't know. That all being said, I applaud those who are able to readily wade through the very confusing profession systems in World of Warcraft. I do miss the days when I could just go out with my miner jewel crafter, smelt some of the ore, prospect the rest, and just get enough ingots and jewels to be able to craft something nice that may even be useful to one of my alts. Those days seem to be past. It's all mostly folks using professions to earn gold these days. I'm not judging folks who do that. I mean, it's just, I'm only vaguely interested in that myself. I don't know, really, it's not my jam. I just like gathering mats and making things to use. Is that so weird? Let me know what you think. Post your comments below. If you like this video, toss a like on it. And if you like the channel and the content in general that I put out, please drop a subscribe on the channel. It costs you absolutely nothing. So, these are my current thoughts on WoW professions. You can see my jewel crafter has spent way more time mining than jewel crafting. I could go on a different rant about how shitty jewel crafting prospecting is these days. Because prospecting kind of sucks in Midnight. Because, yeah, you go prospecting and you're going to, put something in there to salvage, and the chance that you actually get a jewel out of it, very infinitesimal. It's no bueno. So, of course, there's things in the specializations that you can use to make that better. It still is not as good as it used to be. And that's just not me putting on my nostalgia glasses. It's just, I liked it better in the old days, that's all. So, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I will have other video content coming out at you every week. Multiple times a week. Also, check out my stuff on twitch.tv/LochoStream, twitch.tv/DDO stream, where I am a content creator for both the Lord of the Rings Online and Dungeons & Dragons Online under the aegis of Standing Stone Games. And do lots of giveaways of freebies for either of those games. I also will occasionally play WoW, sometimes Dune Awakening, sometimes Ark, except it likes to melt my computer. And also No Man's Sky whenever they do an expedition, because that shit is cool. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your night. Bye! Stormlost says bye too. Kitty, say bye.